Loneliness is a strange kind of silence, it echoes even when nothing moves. Eleanor never expected her golden years to feel so empty, tucked inside a house filled with memories and shadows. But when a playful puppy named Apollo enters her life, joy returns, only to be followed by something else. And when a parrot with a too-human voice starts calling her name at night, Eleanor begins to wonder. Is she healing from the past, or is something reaching out from it? Chapter 1, A Quiet That Feels Too Loud. The kettle clicked off with a hiss, but Eleanor didn't move. She sat in her kitchen, hands resting around a chipped mug, staring out the window at the bare oak trees swaying gently in the morning wind. The farmhouse had been hers for over 40 years, a place once filled with chatter, radio music, and the slam of a screen door every 5 minutes. Now, it was quiet. Too quiet. She breathed in the stillness like it was something she had to get used to, something thick, like fog. The floor creaked under its own weight, even when she sat still. The old radiator rattled every now and then, and somewhere inside the walls, the wood moaned as if remembering voices it hadn't heard in years. Eleanor was 67. She had outlived her husband, her 2 dogs, and most of the people she used to see on Sundays after church. There were days when the silence made her nostalgic. There were nights when it scared her. She ran a hand through her silver hair and sighed. The chair across the table was empty, as always. Her tea had gone cold, as always. And the photograph of her husband, smiling in a flannel shirt with a pipe in hand, sat at the far end of the table, slightly tilted, as if it too was tired of waiting. "I should adopt something," she murmured. "A plant. A fish. Maybe a ghost." She chuckled at her own joke, but the sound was hollow. The kind of laugh you say aloud just to remind yourself your voice still works. A sudden thump upstairs broke the silence. Her body stiffened. It was quick, just one sound, like something small falling onto the wooden floor above. She waited. Nothing followed. "Probably the wind," she said, standing up and wiping her hands on her apron. "This old place makes more noise than I do these days." But still, she glanced at the ceiling one more time before turning on the radio. Static. Then nothing. The same thing had been happening for weeks. The station wouldn't hold. She stopped trying. That evening, as the sun began to dip low and golden across the fields, Eleanor sat in her rocking chair on the porch. The wind had picked up. The trees whispered to each other like old gossiping friends. Then she heard it. A bark. Short. Sharp. Close. She stood slowly, squinting toward the edge of the gravel driveway. And there he was. A young golden retriever, ears perked, tail wagging, looking directly at her with a lopsided grin and a stick in his mouth like an offering. "Well," she whispered, the smallest flicker of warmth rising in her chest, "aren't you brave, showing up uninvited?" The dog barked once more, dropped the stick, and sat. Eleanor smiled, a real one this time. "Let's see if you're just passing through, or if you're meant to stay." She stepped forward. Somewhere far behind her, inside the house, the same thump sounded again. Only this time, it was followed by a faint rustle. And something that almost sounded like a whisper. Chapter 2, A Paw at the Door. The golden retriever didn't leave. Eleanor watched him from the porch for a full 5 minutes before stepping off the last creaking stair and kneeling, ignoring the way her knees objected. The dog remained seated, tail swishing gently behind him in rhythmic sweeps. He didn't bark again. Just stared, like he was waiting for something. "You've got a good face," she murmured, reaching out cautiously. "Too clean for a stray. What are you doing out here alone, pup?" He leaned forward and licked her hand, then stood up with a bounce and pressed his body against her legs, wagging and warm. Something inside Eleanor cracked, and her throat tightened unexpectedly. Okay, she whispered, blinking quickly. Well, you're friendly. That's a start. She checked his collar, green leather, slightly worn, with a brass tag that read, Apollo. No number. No address. Just the name. She looked up at the sky, now painted in streaks of orange and purple. Apollo, huh? You look like an Apollo. Regal and ridiculous at the same time. Apollo wagged, tongue lolling, as if agreeing with every word. She brought him inside. The house hadn't felt this awake in years. Apollo padded from room to room like he was exploring a childhood memory, tail thumping, nose twitching, paws softly clicking against the hardwood. He stopped in the hallway and sniffed the base of the stairs, then looked back at Eleanor and gave a low, curious huff. You too, huh? She muttered. That noise upstairs? She walked to the bottom of the staircase and looked up. Nothing unusual, same dusty steps, same dim bulb flickering at the top landing. She hadn't used the second floor in a while. The guest bedroom was shut. Her husband's old study was untouched. And the attic. She didn't go into the attic. Come on, boy, she called, stepping into the kitchen. Let's start with dinner. Apollo followed but paused at the hallway again. One ear twitched. That night, Eleanor laid out a folded blanket beside her bed and invited Apollo to sleep indoors, just for the night. He accepted immediately, curling into a cinnamon-colored circle that looked both peaceful and protective. At 2:16 a.m., Eleanor woke to the sound of light scratching at the bedroom door. She sat up, heart skipping. Apollo? The dog lifted his head from the floor and looked at her. The scratching continued. She got up slowly, opened the door, and found nothing there. No wind. No branches. Just silence. She turned back toward the bed, only to hear it again, this time from downstairs. Then, ever so faintly, a voice echoed from the dark hallway. Hello. It was soft. Too soft. Almost like someone was trying to remember how to speak. Apollo growled, low, alert, unmoving. Eleanor backed into the room and closed the door gently. Her hand rested on the old brass knob for several seconds. It was probably nothing. Maybe a dream. But from that night on, she kept the dog inside and the hallway light on. Just in case. Chapter 3, The Bird with Secrets. The day after Apollo's arrival, Eleanor woke to the weight of something different in the house, not heavy like grief, but unfamiliar, like the scent of a new book or an unopened drawer. It was the weight of movement, of breathing, of warmth. Apollo had followed her to every room that morning, his tail wagging with quiet delight, occasionally bumping into table legs or brushing against her shins. She hadn't realized how long it had been since anything in her life had followed her around just to be near her. It made her heart ache and glow at the same time. She took Apollo into town that afternoon to put up some "found dog" signs and check the local shelter, though a small part of her hoped no one would claim him. The receptionist at the front desk shook her head after a brief search. No microchip, she said. But he's in good health. You've got yourself a sweet boy. Eleanor nodded. He's something, isn't he? As she turned to leave, she passed by a small wire cage by the window. Inside, perched tall on a wooden branch, was a bird with iridescent green feathers, a sharp beak, and piercing yellow eyes that seemed to track her movements. Interested in him? Asked a voice behind her, a woman with graying hair and a veterinary badge. Eleanor paused. The parrot? His name's Whistle. African gray parrot. Smart as anything. Was surrendered yesterday. Owner passed away, and no family wanted him. Whistle cocked his head. Whistle's been here before, the woman added. He's been adopted and returned 3 times. People say he makes strange sounds at night. But he's harmless. Probably just mimicking what he heard in past homes. Eleanor looked at Apollo, then at Whistle. I live alone, she said quietly. But I'm starting not to. The vet smiled. Want to take him home for a trial? Whistle squawked suddenly, a harsh, dry hello. Apollo jumped. Eleanor chuckled. Well, she sighed. Why not? That evening, the house felt fuller. Whistle's cage was placed near the kitchen window, where the sun came in warm and low. Apollo lay nearby on the floor, watching the bird with cautious curiosity. Whistle didn't speak much at first. He preened, blinked, and occasionally made clicking sounds. But then, as dusk slipped into evening and the house began to settle, Whistle let out a sound that made Eleanor drop her fork. Eleanor. It was a perfect mimic of a man's voice. Hesitant. Soft. Her husband's voice. Apollo stood up instantly, tail rigid, ears perked. He looked at her, then at the bird. Whistle tilted his head. Eleanor, he repeated, softer now. Then, come here. She stood frozen. Her mouth dry. Her heart a slow, echoing thud in her chest. It had been years since she'd heard those words spoken in that voice. And no one in that shelter knew her name. She swallowed hard, stepping toward the cage. Where did you learn that? Whistle didn't answer. He just blinked. Then clicked his beak once. Apollo let out a low, uncertain woof. That night, Eleanor placed a blanket over Whistle's cage, as instructed. But long after the lights went out, she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Somewhere in the darkness, muffled but clear, came the whisper of her name once more. Not from her dreams. From downstairs. Chapter 4, Bark vs. Squawk. The next morning, Eleanor awoke with a jolt. Not to the creaking of floorboards or the groan of old pipes, but to the sound of barking. Loud, chaotic, playful barking. Apollo. She scrambled out of bed and hurried toward the kitchen, heart pounding, unsure if the noise meant trouble or excitement. It was both. Apollo stood in front of Whistle's cage, tail wagging at warp speed, his entire backside swinging like a pendulum. He barked once more, sharp, short, and not at all threatening, more like he was talking. Whistle responded instantly. Woof, he squawked. It was a near-perfect imitation of Apollo's bark. Loud, clipped, and just a little too enthusiastic. Apollo froze mid-bark, tilted his head, and then barked again. Whistle squawked louder, woof, woof. Apollo took a step back. His ears perked. Then he zoomed in a circle and ran back to the cage as if trying to figure out whether he'd just made a friend or conjured some barking ghost. Eleanor laughed. Actually laughed. Boys, she said, her voice full of startled joy. Are we having a morning conversation? Apollo turned and looked up at her, wagging proudly. Whistle clicked his beak, then let out a haughty, good boy. Eleanor blinked. Did you say that to yourself? Whistle didn't answer. Apollo barked once more. Whistle squawked in response. And just like that, it became a game. The day passed in a rhythm of noises, Apollo barking, Whistle barking back, Apollo chasing his tail, Whistle saying, go. Go. Go, like a tiny coach on a perch. Eleanor couldn't stop smiling. But something else lingered, just under the surface. Each time Whistle mimicked a new sound, it was almost too accurate. He didn't just parrot Apollo's bark, he matched the pitch, the rhythm, the exact tone. And when Eleanor stepped away for a moment and returned to hear her own voice say, don't forget your tea, whispered in Whistle's perfect impression of her, her hands went cold. Whistle had never heard her say that out loud. Not recently. She stared at the bird. He stared back, blinking slowly. Apollo let out a quiet woof and came to sit beside her, leaning his warm body against her leg. She shook her head and chuckled, trying to chase away the chill in her spine. You two are going to drive me mad. That night, just as she turned off the kitchen light, Whistle said clearly. Close the door. Eleanor froze. She hadn't said that. Not then. Not in days. Apollo looked up from his blanket, ears twitching. She turned slowly, hands still hovering over the light switch. Whistle, she whispered. But the parrot had tucked his head under his wing, already still and silent. Only the sound of the wind outside answered her. And somewhere, far in the back of the house, a door creaked softly. Chapter 5, Strange Sounds After Sundown. Eleanor hadn't slept well in days. Not because of nightmares, she didn't have those anymore. No, her nights were filled with almost. Almost asleep. Almost hearing something. Almost catching a whisper that wasn't hers. Apollo had begun sleeping beside her bed full-time now. He never barked after dark, but he'd often lift his head around 3 or 4 a.m., ears alert, nose twitching. His tail wouldn't wag, not at those times. It would stay still, heavy. And Whistle. Whistle had stopped mimicking Apollo's barks. He'd moved on to other things. That evening, Eleanor brewed herself a cup of chamomile tea and carried it to the living room. Apollo followed close behind, curling into a ball at her feet the moment she sat down. The house was quiet in that way old houses get before they remember to make noise, like it was holding its breath. Whistle watched her from his cage across the room. She looked back at him. "You're quiet tonight," she said, sipping carefully. The parrot blinked slowly. Then tilted his head. Then, nothing. Eleanor exhaled. Maybe it was all settling down. She reached over for the photo album on the coffee table, the one with the soft leather cover and gold-edged pages. She hadn't opened it in a long time. Too long. She flipped through it carefully. Birthdays. Thanksgiving dinners. Her husband's hand on her shoulder. Their old dog, Charlie, nestled beside him on the couch. She hadn't meant to cry, but the tears came softly, unannounced. Whistle let out a sudden sound, a soft, rolling whistle, a tune she hadn't heard in years. It was Charlie's whistle. The one Richard used to call him back in from the yard. Eleanor sat bolt upright. "Whistle, how do you know that?" Whistle said nothing. Apollo's ears perked up, and he stood, tail stiff. Then, faintly, a voice from the hallway. "Come on, boy." Richard's voice. Exactly as it had sounded. Low. Gentle. Full of love. The teacup shook in Eleanor's hand. Apollo let out a low growl and took one step forward. Then another. The hallway was dark. Too dark. She rose to her feet, heart pounding, and turned on the lamp beside the couch. Whistle rustled his feathers, eyes still locked on the hallway. Then he whispered, in a voice no one living had used in her house for years. "I miss you, Ellie." She dropped the tea. Porcelain shattered on the floor. Apollo barked once, loud, protective, real, breaking the silence like glass. The voice did not return. Later that night, Eleanor sat on the floor beside Apollo, stroking his fur with trembling hands. "I'm not crazy," she whispered into the darkness. "I'm not losing it." Whistle said nothing. But from his cage, his eyes stayed open. Watching. And when the wind passed outside the window, Eleanor swore she saw a shadow move across the far wall, but no figure to cast it. Chapter 6, Storm Night. The storm rolled in before sunset. Dark clouds gathered above the hills like a warning Eleanor could feel in her chest. By the time the rain began to drum against the windows, the wind had already turned cold and mean. Branches scraped the roof. The house groaned like something uneasy. Apollo had been pacing for an hour. He hated storms. Eleanor had learned that quickly. He'd whimper once, then circle the living room, tail low, ears flattened, occasionally running to her side and pressing his warm body against her knees like a child seeking comfort. "It's all right, boy," she whispered, stroking his head as thunder cracked in the distance. "It's just noise." But even as she said it, she wasn't entirely sure she believed herself. Whistle had been silent all evening. Too silent. Not a squawk. Not a chirp. Not even the usual preening clicks he made as he cleaned his feathers. Just stillness. Eleanor tried not to notice. She focused on her tea, on the steady tick of the kitchen clock, on Apollo's weight resting at her feet. Another crash of thunder. The lights flickered. Once. Then again. And then everything went dark. Apollo leapt up, growling low. Eleanor stood carefully, her hand feeling along the edge of the counter for the flashlight she kept in the drawer. The house was pitch black, lit only by the occasional flash of lightning that illuminated the room for half seconds at a time, like snapshots of a world not quite real. Then came the voice. "Get out." Sharp. Whispered. "Mail. Too close." Apollo barked, loud and fast, moving between Eleanor and the dark hallway. The flashlight finally clicked on, casting a narrow beam that jittered with the tremble in her hands. "Whistle," she called, her voice unsteady. "Is that you?" No answer. She swung the light toward the cage. Empty. The cage door was open. "No, no, no," she murmured, heart thudding in her ears. "You were locked." "I closed it. I closed it." Lightning flashed again. For one breathless moment, she saw Whistle perched on the top of the grandfather clock, wings outstretched, feathers puffed up, staring directly at her. And then he spoke. "I know what you did." The voice wasn't Richard's this time. It was hers. Her own voice. Cold. Hollow. Repeating words she couldn't remember ever saying. "I never said that," she whispered, flashlight trembling. Apollo growled louder. The storm raged outside. Suddenly, a loud bang came from upstairs, like something heavy falling. Then footsteps, slow, deliberate, above them. "There's no one here," she said aloud, backing into the living room. "There's no one else here." Whistle glided back to his cage, silent now. The door swung shut behind him as if caught in an invisible wind. The flashlight flickered and died. Eleanor and Apollo stood in the darkness, frozen. Then. Tap. 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 The sound of knocking, from inside the attic. Chapter 7, What the Parrot Remembers. Morning came slowly, as if the storm had drained the house of energy. The sky outside was gray and dripping, soft rain soaking the ground in a steady whisper. Eleanor hadn't slept. She sat at the kitchen table, her robe loosely tied, hands curled around a cup of black coffee she hadn't touched. Apollo lay at her feet, wide awake, eyes tracking every creak the old farmhouse made. Whistle sat quietly on his perch, unusually still. She hadn't said a word since sunrise. Not after what happened. Not after the knocking in the attic. Not after hearing her own voice from the beak of a parrot. At around 6:30 a.m., Eleanor stood and walked, slowly, hesitantly, into the hallway. She stared up the staircase, where the dim yellow light bulb flickered near the top. The attic door was still closed. She hadn't opened it in years. Richard used to go up there sometimes, rummaging through boxes of holiday lights or old camping gear. But not her. Never her. Still, something pulled at her now, not fear, not quite, more like need. To understand. To remember. To know why her house, her bird, her life had begun speaking in voices long gone. She grabbed the flashlight again and slowly ascended the stairs. Apollo whined at the base, pacing in small circles, refusing to follow. At the top of the stairs, Eleanor paused. The attic door stood before her, cracked open now, as if it had been waiting. She reached forward, nudged it gently. The door creaked wide. Dust filtered in thin beams through the slats of the roof. Old furniture, trunks and boxes crowded the space like forgotten ghosts. She stepped inside, her shoes crunching over old papers and grit. She hadn't been here since before Richard died. On a small wooden table near the window sat a box she didn't recognize. Square. Metal latched. Weathered. She knelt, opened it, and froze. Inside. A faded collar, not from Apollo, or even Charlie, their last dog. A photo of a young man she didn't know standing with a gray parrot on his arm, in this house. A letter. Folded. Yellowed. Addressed to Mr. Grant Holloway, the owner before them. Her breath caught. Whistle had lived here before. Long before. She opened the letter. To whoever finds this bird. Please know, he remembers things. Things he shouldn't. He doesn't just mimic, he reflects. Be careful what you say around him. Some words, once heard, never leave. Eleanor looked up slowly, heart pounding. What are you, Whistle? Back downstairs, the parrot shifted on his perch. Then, in a gentle, distant voice, one she now realized wasn't hers, or Richard's, or anyone she'd ever known, he said. I told him not to go up there. The voice was male. Quiet. Sad. Apollo stood and barked, once. Not aggressive. Protective. Eleanor felt a wave of emotion rise in her chest, not fear, this time. Grief. Confusion. A feeling that the house had never just been hers. That Whistle had lived through stories she'd never heard, and had never stopped listening. She looked at the photo again, the man with the parrot. Whistle hadn't forgotten him. Maybe Whistle hadn't forgotten anything. Chapter 8, Light in the Shadows. That evening, Eleanor lit candles. Not out of fear this time, but as a comfort, a soft rebellion against the unnatural stillness that had hovered in her home for weeks. She placed one in the hallway, one in the kitchen, and one on the windowsill near Whistle's cage. The warm glow cast gentle shadows across the walls, stretching and swaying like memories trying to dance. Whistle sat quietly on his perch, ruffling his feathers, occasionally turning to glance at her. His eyes no longer looked mischievous or eerie. They looked tired. Like he had been carrying too many voices for too long. Apollo, as always, stayed close. But his tension had eased. He no longer growled at the dark corners of the hallway. Instead, he lay with his head resting on Eleanor's foot, tail thumping lazily now and then. For the first time in weeks, the house felt like it was breathing with her, not against her. Eleanor sat on the couch, the box of old letters still beside her. She had read each one twice, tracing the faded ink with her fingers. They told a simple but tragic story. Grant Holloway had lived in the house alone for many years, raising Whistle from a hatchling. He had loved deeply and lost painfully. The letters were never sent. Some were addressed to a brother, others to a woman named Margaret. Most ended abruptly, as if the words became too hard to finish. But every letter mentioned Whistle. How the bird began to speak in voices that Grant swore he hadn't taught. How Whistle whispered things he only thought but never said aloud. How, in the end, Grant wondered if the bird had absorbed his grief so completely that it began to echo it back. Eleanor looked at Whistle now, and in a quiet moment, she whispered, "You've carried too much." Whistle blinked slowly, then let out a low, weary whistle. It wasn't eerie. It wasn't sharp. It was soft. Apollo stood and trotted over to the cage. He sat in front of it and gave a gentle bark. Then another. Whistle tilted his head. "Good boy," he said, not perfectly mimicked, but spoken like he meant it. And just like that, something shifted. The room, the house, it felt different. Lighter. Whistle stepped down from his perch and began softly repeating words he hadn't used in days. "Pretty bird. Hello. Hello, Apollo. Good boy. The storm was gone. The attic was quiet. And the shadows no longer lingered, they moved with the flicker of the candlelight, soft and harmless. That night, for the first time in years, Eleanor laughed aloud. Whistle squawked with delight. Apollo barked, spun in a circle, and slid across the wooden floor. The house didn't feel haunted anymore. It felt, lived in. Chapter 9, The Voice That Wasn't Haunting. Eleanor stood at the edge of her porch with a cup of warm cider in her hands, watching the sky turn pale blue. The clouds had finally broken, revealing a soft autumn morning. The air smelled of wet earth, wood smoke, and leaves. Behind her, the house was quiet, not with silence, but with peace. Apollo lay in the patch of sunlight by the door, tail flicking now and then as he dozed. Whistle preened himself lazily near the window, muttering familiar words in his now endearing patchwork of voices. Good boy. Eleanor. Hello, Apollo. Even the occasional bark was gentler now, almost playful. But it was the voice Eleanor had once feared that had changed the most. It no longer startled her. It didn't haunt the hallway or echo like a cold breath in the dark. Instead, it whispered now only in quiet moments. Not always in words, but in feelings. Like yesterday, when she dropped a cup in the kitchen, and Whistle had said, softly, "Be careful, sweetheart." It had been Richard's voice. Yes. But not twisted or eerie. It had felt like a memory speaking kindly back to her. She hadn't cried. She'd smiled. Eleanor had finally come to believe something. Maybe Whistle wasn't haunted at all. Maybe he remembered because no one else could. Maybe what had seemed like haunting was simply holding on. That afternoon, she sat with the photo of Grant Holloway, Whistle's first owner, and lit a small candle next to it. She whispered a thank you. For loving him first, she said. And for leaving him somewhere safe. That night, Eleanor moved Whistle's cage closer to her reading chair. Apollo curled up on the rug beneath them. As she turned a page of her book, Whistle looked at her and said in a voice that was gentle and unfamiliar, not hers, not Richard's, not Grant's, but new. "You're not alone." She looked up. Her throat tightened. And she smiled. "No," she whispered, glancing at both of them. "I'm not." Chapter 10, Full of Life Again. The house didn't feel old anymore. It still had its creaks, its whispers in the walls, its occasional hum of something deeper, but now, those sounds were familiar. Lived in. Less like echoes of grief and more like the sound of a heart beating again. It had been just under 2 months since Apollo and Whistle arrived. Since Eleanor had laughed, cried, and faced the attic. Since the voices no longer haunted her but helped her remember. And now? Now, her house was full of life. Apollo had claimed the backyard like a king with his own little kingdom, bounding after squirrels and sticks with joy too large for his body. He loved visitors, especially children, and soon, Eleanor found herself welcoming neighbors she hadn't spoken to in years. Whistle had become a bit of a local legend. Word spread in town that Eleanor's parrot talks like a real person. Some were curious, others skeptical, but nearly all who visited left with wide eyes and warm hearts. One afternoon, a little girl from next door leaned over to Whistle and asked, "Do you know any secrets?" Whistle blinked, tilted his head, and said softly, "Hug your mom." The girl ran home smiling. And Eleanor stood in the doorway, hand over her heart, watching sunlight pour across the floor. Eleanor no longer feared the quiet. She sat on the porch most evenings, a mug of cider in one hand, Apollo's head resting on her foot, and Whistle softly whistling old songs nearby. The three of them, unlikely companions, bound not by chance, but by some strange grace, shared something deeper than understanding. They shared healing. Sometimes, Whistle still said things that made her pause, phrases that came from no one in particular. Bits of emotion wrapped in voices she couldn't quite place. But Eleanor had stopped asking where those words came from. Some things aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to be felt. One golden afternoon, a neighborhood boy asked her, "Is your house still haunted?" Eleanor smiled and looked at the worn porch boards, the dancing curtain, the open window where Whistle sat humming to himself. She looked at Apollo, his head raised as a breeze passed, his tail tapping gently against the step. "No," she said, kneeling beside him. "It's not haunted." She ran her fingers through Apollo's soft fur. "It's just, full." Sometimes, healing doesn't come with answers. It comes with a bark in the hallway, a whisper in the dark. And a parrot who remembers what your heart forgot. If this story touched you, even just a little, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. We have so many more stories waiting to be told. And who knows? The next one might just find you. Until then, hug your pets, listen for the quiet moments. And remember, you're never truly alone.